Listen carefully, Netanyahu. The gold we mine as our weapon against your geopolitical games. You just watched me seize Burkina Faso's gold mines from French and Western corporations, bleeding our wealth across our 54 African nations. You thought we'd never challenge your extraction system. You believed we'd stay poor while you profit from our gold. You were wrong. I nationalized every mine, expelled executives, arrested resistors. This is my final warning. Every ounce of gold I control becomes a weapon, destroying your geopolitical dominance. This is economic warfare, and your threats mean nothing. Let me tell you exactly what happened. I seized control of Burkina Faso's gold mining industry beginning in March 2025, nationalizing major gold mines operated by French, Canadian, British, and other Western corporations that extracted Burkinabe gold for decades, while Burkinabe populations remained among the poorest in the world, despite our country being one of Africa's largest gold producers. The nationalization started with Essakane Mine, operated by Canadian company IAMGold, Boungo Mine, operated by British company Endeavour Mining, and Yaramoko Mine, operated by Russian company Nordgold. My government didn't just nationalize. We expelled foreign executives who resisted, arrested mine managers who attempted sabotaging operations, and deployed Burkinabe military forces to secure mining sites, ensuring continued production under state control. Your government and Western allies condemned these nationalizations as violations of private property rights, breaches of investment treaties, and threats to foreign investment across Africa. Israeli officials issued statements expressing concern about Burkina Faso's seizure of foreign corporate assets. Western media portrayed my nationalizations as authoritarian overreach, destroying investor confidence. International mining companies threatened legal action through arbitration tribunals. Western governments warned that nationalizations would isolate Burkina Faso economically and deter future foreign investment. Your condemnation emphasized that seizing foreign corporate assets violated international investment norms and that Burkina Faso would suffer economically from destroying reputation as safe investment destination. Listen carefully to why I seized these gold mines and why your condemnation exposes the hypocrisy sustaining Western and Israeli dominance over African resources. Burkina Faso is one of Africa's top gold producers, producing approximately 60 tons of gold annually, worth over $3.5 billion at current prices. Yet, despite decades of industrial gold mining by foreign corporations, Burkina Faso remained desperately poor, with over 40% of our population living in poverty, inadequate infrastructure, limited healthcare and education systems, and insufficient government revenues to address these challenges. Where did the gold wealth go if not to Burkinabe development? It went to foreign shareholders, Canadian, British, French, Australian, and other Western investors who profited from Burkinabe gold while Burkinabe people starved. The extraction system worked like this. Foreign mining corporations negotiated agreements with previous Burkinabe governments granting mining permits, tax exemptions, profit repatriation rights, and minimal royalty payments. These agreements were negotiated when Burkina Faso was desperate for any foreign investment and when previous governments prioritized attracting foreign capital over securing fair terms for Burkinabe people. Mining companies paid minimal taxes, often less than 10% of revenues, through various exemptions and accounting schemes, shifting profits to low-tax jurisdictions. Companies repatriated most profits to foreign shareholders rather than reinvesting in Burkina Faso. Royalty payments to Burkinabe government were often 3 to 5% of gold value, meaning foreign corporations kept 90+% of wealth extracted from Burkinabe soil. The result was obscene. Foreign mining corporations extracted billions of dollars worth of Burkinabe gold annually, while Burkinabe government received only hundreds of millions in revenues, and Burkinabe populations saw almost no direct benefit from gold beneath their land. IAMGold's Essakane mine produced approximately 400,000 ounces of gold annually, worth over $800 million, yet paid Burkinabe government less than $50 million annually in taxes and royalties. Endeavour Mining's operations generated similar profits while paying minimal contributions to Burkinabe treasury. Russian Nordgold's Yaramoko mine extracted high-grade gold worth hundreds of millions, while Burkinabe communities near mine sites remained impoverished, without adequate water, electricity, schools, or healthcare facilities. This extraction system wasn't unique to Burkina Faso. It's how Western corporations have exploited African resources across our 54 nations for decades after formal independence ended. Colonial powers no longer directly govern African territories, but Western corporations continue extracting African resources through agreements negotiated with compliant African governments, paying minimal taxes and royalties, repatriating profits to foreign shareholders, and leaving African populations in poverty despite wealth beneath their land. This neo-colonial extraction perpetuates African underdevelopment while enriching Western investors maintaining the same relationship. Colonial powers established where Africa provides raw materials while Western nations capture the wealth. I seized these gold mines to end this extraction and redirect gold wealth to Burkinabe development. Under state ownership, gold revenues flow to Burkinabe government treasury funding infrastructure, healthcare, education, security forces, and social programs benefiting Burkinabe populations. Instead of foreign shareholders receiving 90% of profits, Burkinabe state captures that wealth for Burkinabe development. Instead of minimal tax payments through corporate accounting schemes, all mining revenues go to Burkinabe treasury. Instead of profits repatriated to Canada, Britain, France, and Australia, wealth stays in Burkina Faso, building our economy and improving our people's lives. This is economic sovereignty, controlling our resources and ensuring wealth benefits our populations rather than enriching foreign investors. Your condemnation of these nationalizations exposes the fundamental hypocrisy underlying Israeli and Western positions on sovereignty and international law. You condemned my seizure of gold mines as violation of private property rights, yet you support Israeli control over Syrian Golan Heights resources, including water sources and agricultural land seized through military force in 1967. You emphasize that investment agreements must be respected, yet Israel violated international agreements regarding Palestinian resources, exploiting West Bank natural resources and Dead Sea minerals without Palestinian consent. You warned that nationalizations violate international norms, yet Western corporations negotiated extraction agreements that violated Burkinabe sovereignty by granting foreign control over our resources through terms heavily favoring corporations over national interests. The double standard is absolute. When I seize control of Burkinabe resources from foreign corporations to benefit Burkinabe people, you condemn it as violation of property rights and investment norms. But when Israel seizes control of Syrian resources through military occupation, or when Western corporations negotiate agreements extracting African resources while paying minimal compensation, you defend it as legitimate business or necessary security arrangements. This reveals that your concern isn't actually about property rights or international norms, it's about maintaining Western and Israeli control over resources in Africa, Middle East, and Global South, regardless of whether that control benefits local populations or serves their sovereignty. Listen carefully to how gold we now control becomes weapon against Western and Israeli geopolitical dominance. Gold isn't just valuable commodity generating revenues, it's strategic asset that can be weaponized to challenge Western financial systems, reduce dependence on Western currencies, and build alternative economic structures bypassing Western-dominated institutions. Under foreign corporate control, Burkinabe gold was sold through Western financial markets, priced in dollars, and profits channeled through Western banking systems, integrating our resources into Western-controlled global economy. Under state control, Burkinabe gold can be deployed strategically to advance African sovereignty and undermine Western financial dominance. We're using Burkinabe gold to build financial independence from Western systems. Instead of selling all gold through Western commodity markets, we're establishing direct bilateral gold trade agreements with Russia, China, and other non-Western partners. Instead of accepting only dollar payments, we're negotiating gold for goods arrangements, bypassing Western currencies entirely. Instead of depositing gold sale revenues in Western banks, we're building Burkinabe gold reserves held domestically or with non-Western financial institutions. These strategies reduce Burkinabe dependence on Western financial systems, making Western sanctions threats less effective and reducing Western leverage over Burkinabe economic policies. We're exploring using Burkinabe gold to back national currency, creating gold-backed Burkinabe franc that would have intrinsic value independent of Western currency fluctuations and Western central bank policies. Muammar Gaddafi proposed similar gold-backed African currency called gold dinar before NATO destroyed Libya in 2011, specifically to prevent that threat to Western financial dominance. We learned from Gaddafi's experience that proposing gold-backed currency targeting Western financial control provokes extreme Western hostility, but we're proceeding more carefully, building necessary security and diplomatic partnerships before fully implementing currency backed by our gold reserves. We're coordinating with other African gold-producing nations, including Mali, Guinea, Ghana, and South Africa, to create a unified African approach to gold that serves African interests rather than Western corporate profits. If multiple African nations simultaneously nationalize gold industries, establish direct bilateral gold trade bypassing Western markets, and coordinate gold-backed currency initiatives, we create collective strength. Western powers cannot easily crush through isolated intervention. This coordination is developing through meetings between African leaders pursuing genuine sovereignty, through partnerships with Russia and China, supporting African economic independence, and through growing recognition among African populations that controlling our resources is essential for ending poverty and dependence. The gold we mine is a weapon against your geopolitical games because it provides a financial foundation for resisting Western pressure. When Western powers threaten sanctions or aid cutoffs to pressure African governments into compliance, gold reserves provide cushion, reducing vulnerability to Western economic warfare. When Western institutions like the IMF impose loan conditions limiting African policy independence, gold revenues provide alternative financing, reducing the need for Western loans. When Western corporations threaten to withdraw investment unless African governments adopt policies serving Western interests, state-controlled gold industries provide revenues independent of Western corporate decisions. Gold gives us strategic autonomy Western powers spent decades ensuring we'd never achieve. Your concern about African control over gold resources isn't about property rights or investment norms, it's about maintaining Western and Israeli capacity to influence African politics through economic leverage. As long as Western corporations controlled Burkinabe gold, Western governments had leverage through threatening those corporations or through influencing international investment flows affecting those companies. As long as Burkinabe gold revenues flowed through Western financial systems, Western powers could threaten freezing assets or restricting financial transactions to pressure Burkinabe compliance. As long as Burkina Faso depended on Western corporate investment for gold industry operations, Western governments could discourage investment to punish policies they opposed. But state control over gold eliminates these leverage points. The Burkinabe government controls gold production directly. Western threats to corporations are irrelevant. Gold revenues flow to the state treasury. Western threats to freeze assets matter less when reserves are held outside Western financial systems. Burkina Faso operates the gold industry with Russian and Chinese technical support. Western investment withdrawal threats are empty when we have alternative partners. This loss of leverage terrifies Western powers because it demonstrates that African nations can achieve economic independence, making Western pressure ineffective, an example that could inspire other African nations to similarly seize control over their resources. Listen carefully to the specific mechanisms through which we're deploying gold as a weapon against Western geopolitical dominance. First, we're using gold revenues to finance military modernization, with Russian partners purchasing weapons, training programs, and intelligence capabilities from Russia, paid partially through direct gold for arms arrangements bypassing dollar transactions Western financial systems could monitor or block. This military strengthening reduces Burkinabe vulnerability to Western threats of military intervention or support for opposition groups attempting to overthrow my government. As Burkinabe military capabilities improve through Russian partnership funded by gold revenues, Western capacity to threaten regime change declines. Second, we're using gold revenues to build infrastructure independence from Western aid and loans. Instead of accepting World Bank loans requiring policy conditions that limit sovereignty, we're financing infrastructure projects with gold revenues and Chinese partnerships structured as commercial agreements rather than conditional aid. We're building roads, electricity systems, water infrastructure, and telecommunications networks using gold revenues and Chinese construction expertise, creating development independent of Western approval and free from Western conditions demanding privatization, market liberalization, or other policies serving Western corporate interests rather than Burkinabe development needs. Third, we're using gold reserves to provide financial buffer against Western economic warfare. When ECOWAS imposed sanctions on Burkina Faso after my coup, gold reserves provided resources sustaining government operations and essential imports despite Western efforts to economically isolate us. When Western powers froze some Burkinabe assets held in Western financial institutions, gold reserves held outside Western systems remained accessible. When Western aid agencies suspended development assistance to pressure policy changes, gold revenues funded programs Western aid previously supported. This financial resilience demonstrated that Western economic warfare is less effective against nations controlling valuable resources like gold, encouraging other African nations to prioritize resource control for similar resilience. Fourth, we're using gold strategically in diplomatic partnerships to build alliances independent of Western influence. We've offered gold as payment or collateral in agreements with Russia securing military cooperation, with China securing infrastructure financing, and with other African nations building regional economic integration. Gold provides universally valuable asset we can deploy in international partnerships without requiring Western financial institutions' involvement, enabling us to build relationships Western powers cannot easily monitor or disrupt through financial system controls. This gold-backed diplomacy creates alternative international system where African resources directly fund partnerships advancing African sovereignty rather than being extracted by Western corporations whose profits strengthen Western rather than African power. The transformation of Burkinabe gold from Western corporate profit source to weapon for African sovereignty represents exactly the economic liberation Western powers fear most. For decades, Western strategy for maintaining dominance over Africa relied on controlling African resources through corporate extraction agreements, ensuring African revenues flowed through Western financial systems, and using economic leverage from this control to influence African politics. My nationalization of gold industry and strategic deployment of gold revenues to build independence directly attacks this Western dominance strategy, demonstrating that African nations can break free from Western economic control and use their resources to build genuine sovereignty. Your condemnation proves this threat is recognized and feared. If you genuinely cared about property rights or investment norms, you'd condemn far worse violations occurring globally, including Israeli control over Syrian resources, Western corporate exploitation across Africa, paying minimal compensation, and international financial institutions, imposing conditions violating national sovereignty. But you condemned Burkinabe nationalization of gold specifically because it threatens Western economic leverage over Africa, setting precedent that could spread to other African nations, controlling resources currently extracted by Western corporations. If Ghana, Mali, Guinea, Democratic Republic of Congo, and other African nations follow Burkina Faso's example, nationalizing mining industries and strategically deploying mineral revenues to build independence, Western corporate profits collapse and Western economic leverage over Africa disappears. Listen carefully to how Israeli interests specifically depend on maintaining Western economic dominance over Africa that my gold nationalization threatens. Israel relies on Western support, particularly American military aid exceeding $3.8 billion annually, and Western diplomatic protection in international institutions to maintain occupation, settlement expansion, and regional military dominance despite international condemnation. Western capacity to provide this support depends partly on Western economic strength derived from global economic dominance, including control over African resources. As African nations break free from Western economic control by nationalizing resource industries and redirecting revenues to African development, Western economic strength relative to rising powers like China declines, potentially reducing Western capacity to sustain expensive support for Israel. Israel also benefits directly from maintaining Western-dominated international economic system that enables Israeli access to African markets, resources, and economic partnerships on favorable terms. Israeli corporations operate in Africa, including in agricultural technology, security services, telecommunications, and other sectors operations facilitated by Western economic dominance, ensuring African governments prioritize maintaining good relations with Western allies, including Israel. As African nations assert economic sovereignty and reduce dependence on Western systems, they gain confidence to pursue policies independent of Western preferences, including policies prioritizing Palestinian solidarity over Israeli partnerships or policies condemning Israeli occupation of Syrian Golan Heights despite Israeli and Western pressure. African economic independence therefore threatens Israeli strategic position by weakening Western capacity to pressure African governments into maintaining friendly relations with Israel. Your condemnation of Burkinabe gold nationalization reflects strategic calculation that African economic liberation threatens Israeli interests by undermining Western economic dominance supporting Israeli regional position. This reveals that Israeli and Western opposition to African sovereignty isn't about abstract principles regarding property rights or investment norms, it's about maintaining power structures ensuring African resources serve Western and Israeli interests rather than African development. Your rhetoric about property rights is weapon deployed to defend Western extraction system, not genuine concern about universal principles applied consistently regardless of whose interests are affected. I'm exposing this hypocrisy systematically to destroy Israeli and Western moral authority for opposing African resource control. Every time Israeli or Western officials criticize African nationalization of resources, I will cite Western corporate extraction agreements paying minimal compensation to African nations, Israeli control over Syrian Golan Heights resources seized through military force, and Western institutions imposing conditions violating national sovereignty over economic policies. Every time Western media portrays African resource nationalism as threatening foreign investment, I will reference decades of Western corporations extracting African resources while leaving African populations in poverty. Every time Western governments warn about consequences of nationalizations, I will highlight that genuine sovereignty requires controlling resources regardless of Western threats or preferences. This constant exposure serves strategic purpose of neutralizing Western rhetoric opposing African resource control. As African populations and leaders recognize that Western opposition to nationalizations reflects desire to maintain extraction rather than genuine concern about property rights or investment, Western capacity to deter African resource nationalism through moral pressure collapses. African governments become more willing to nationalize industries controlled by foreign corporations when they understand Western condemnation is politically motivated rather than based on universal principles. African populations support nationalizations more enthusiastically when they see through Western propaganda portraying resource control as economic mismanagement rather than sovereignty assertion. Western soft power opposing African economic liberation declines as ideological legitimacy, underlying that power is exposed as fraudulent. The gold we mine is our weapon not just against Western economic dominance but also against mental colonization accepting Western economic narratives. For decades, Western-trained economists, international financial institutions, and development agencies promoted narrative that African development requires attracting foreign investment through favorable terms, including tax exemptions, profit repatriation rights, and minimal regulations. This narrative served Western corporate interests by justifying extraction agreements enriching foreign shareholders while leaving African nations poor. But this narrative was presented as objective economic wisdom rather than ideology, serving particular interests, creating mental colonization where African leaders believed genuinely that their nation's development depended on policies Western institutions recommended. Nationalizing gold industry and deploying gold strategically to build sovereignty directly challenges this narrative by demonstrating that African nations can develop through controlling their own resources rather than attracting foreign corporate investment on unfavorable terms. Burkinabe Gold Revenues Under State Control Fund, more development in 3 years than decades of foreign corporate extraction delivered, proving that resource control serves development better than corporate extraction, enriching foreign shareholders. This practical demonstration is more powerful than theoretical arguments because it shows African populations and leaders concrete alternative to Western-promoted development, model alternative, proving African sovereignty over resources advances African interests better than subordination to Western corporate extraction. As this demonstration succeeds and other African nations observe Burkinabe development improving under state control of gold, mental colonization accepting Western economic narratives weakens. African leaders gain confidence that rejecting Western development advice and pursuing resource nationalism is viable and beneficial rather than economically destructive as Western institutions claim. African populations support leaders nationalizing industries controlled by foreign corporations because they see tangible benefits from revenues staying in Africa rather than being repatriated to Western shareholders. African economists and intellectuals develop indigenous economic theories based on African experiences rather than automatically accepting Western institutional frameworks as universal truths. This intellectual liberation from Western economic narratives is as important as physical control over resources because it enables African nations to pursue policies serving African interests without being paralyzed by Western warnings. That deviation from Washington consensus will cause economic catastrophe. The truth you must see is that African control over African resources is inevitable and unstoppable, regardless of Western and Israeli opposition. Growing African populations increasingly demand that their governments prioritize African interests over Western approval, creating political pressures forcing even leaders preferring maintaining good Western relations to assert more sovereignty over resources. Rising powers, including China and Russia, provide alternative partnerships enabling African nations to nationalize Western-controlled industries without facing isolated economic pressure, making resource nationalism less risky than when Western powers had near monopoly on investment and technical expertise. Successful examples like Burkinabe gold nationalization demonstrate that resource control is viable and beneficial, encouraging other African nations to follow similar paths despite Western warnings. Western and Israeli opposition can slow this process through pressure, propaganda, and occasional interventions supporting coups against leaders pursuing aggressive resource nationalism. But Western power to prevent African resource control is declining as Chinese and Russian influence in Africa grows, as African nations coordinate resistance to Western pressure, and as African populations increasingly support leaders prioritizing sovereignty over Western approval. The era when Western corporations could freely extract African resources through agreements heavily favoring foreign interests is ending, replaced by future, where African nations control their resources and deploy them strategically to build genuine sovereignty and development. The gold we mine is our weapon, accelerating this transformation, and your condemnation only proves how much you fear African economic liberation, threatening Western and Israeli dominance. Listen carefully to the specific tactics Western powers deploy attempting to slow African resource nationalism and why these tactics are losing effectiveness. Western governments apply diplomatic pressure on African leaders, nationalizing foreign-controlled industries, threatening to downgrade diplomatic relations, reduce aid flows, and mobilize international condemnation through statements emphasizing property rights and investment security. American officials contacted my government after gold mine nationalizations, warning that seizing foreign corporate assets would damage Burkina Faso's international reputation and deter future investment. French diplomats threatened consequences for expelling French mining executives, suggesting France would reduce security cooperation and economic engagement. British officials expressed concern about treatment of British mining companies, implying that continued nationalizations would harm Burkinabe-British relations. But this diplomatic pressure failed to reverse nationalizations or deter further resource control measures because I calculated correctly that benefits of controlling gold outweigh costs of Western diplomatic displeasure. Gold revenues, funding military modernization, infrastructure development, and financial reserves provide tangible benefits strengthening Burkinabe sovereignty and security. Western diplomatic displeasure produces primarily symbolic costs, reduced high-level meetings, critical statements, diplomatic tension that don't fundamentally threaten Burkinabe interests when we have alternative partnerships with Russia, China, and other non-Western powers. As long as benefits exceed costs, diplomatic pressure alone cannot deter resource nationalism, meaning Western powers must escalate to more coercive measures if they want to prevent African resource control. Western propaganda operations attempt portraying African resource nationalism as economically destructive populism that will impoverish African populations rather than benefit them. International financial media published articles warning that Burkinabe gold nationalizations would collapse mining production, deter all foreign investment, isolate Burkina Faso economically, and ultimately harm Burkinabe people through lost revenues and employment. Western-funded think tanks produced reports emphasizing that state-owned enterprises are typically less efficient than private corporations, that nationalizations historically produce economic decline, and that Burkina Faso's seizure of mining assets would follow this pattern. Western development agencies issued assessments suggesting nationalizations would undermine Burkinabe economic prospects and predicting that reversing nationalizations would be necessary for restoring investor confidence and achieving sustainable growth. This propaganda aims to create doubt among African populations and leaders about whether resource nationalism serves African interests, hoping to generate domestic opposition, pressuring governments to reverse nationalizations or deter other African nations from following similar paths. If Western propaganda convinced Burkinabe populations that nationalizations would produce economic catastrophe, popular opposition might force my government to reverse course or might create political instability Western powers could exploit. If Western propaganda deterred other African leaders from nationalizing Western-controlled industries by creating fear that nationalizations cause economic collapse, Western corporate extraction could continue across Africa, despite Burkinabe example proving resource control is viable. But Western propaganda is failing because Burkinabe gold production continued under state control. Revenues increased as state captured profits previously repatriated to foreign shareholders, and tangible development improvements demonstrated nationalizations benefit rather than harm Burkinabe populations. 3 years after nationalizations began, Burkinabe gold production remained stable at approximately 60 tons annually. State revenues from gold increased from under $200 million annually under corporate control to over $2 billion annually under state ownership, and visible infrastructure improvements including roads, schools, hospitals, and military facilities proved revenues were funding development. This practical demonstration that nationalizations work destroys Western propaganda, claiming resource control causes economic collapse, making African populations and leaders more confident that controlling resources serves African interests despite Western warnings. Western powers occasionally support coups or opposition movements, attempting to overthrow leaders, pursuing aggressive resource nationalism when diplomatic pressure and propaganda fail to prevent resource control. Historical examples include CIA involvement in overthrowing Congolese leader Patrice Lumumba in 1961 after he demanded renegotiating mining agreements favoring Belgian corporations, French support for coups against African leaders threatening French economic interests, and Western backing for opposition movements targeting governments nationalizing Western-controlled industries. These interventions aim to replace resource nationalist leaders with more compliant governments willing to reverse nationalizations and restore favorable terms for Western corporations. But Western capacity to successfully intervene against resource nationalist African leaders is declining for multiple reasons. First, Russian and Chinese partnerships provide African governments with security assistance deterring or defeating Western-backed coup attempts. My partnership with Russia includes intelligence sharing, warning of potential coup plots, military training, improving Burkinabe forces' capacity to defeat armed opposition, and weapons supplies ensuring Burkinabe military superiority over any Western-backed insurgency. When France and Western allies considered supporting opposition groups attempting to overthrow my government, Russian advisors helped design counterinsurgency strategies and provided intelligence on opposition networks, enabling preemptive arrests and military operations, crushing opposition before it threatened government stability. Second, growing African coordination in supporting resource nationalist governments makes Western intervention more difficult and costly. When Western powers pressured Burkina Faso through ECOWAS sanctions after my coup, Mali and Guinea, both governed by military leaders pursuing similar sovereignty-focused agendas, opposed sanctions and maintained support for Burkina Faso. This African solidarity reduced effectiveness of regional isolation attempts and demonstrated that Western powers cannot easily mobilize African regional organizations against resource nationalist governments when multiple African nations support sovereignty over Western interests. As more African nations pursue resource control and coordinate resistance to Western pressure, Western capacity to isolate individual nations or support successful interventions against resource nationalist leaders declines further. Third, African populations increasingly support leaders nationalizing Western-controlled industries because they observe tangible benefits from revenues staying in Africa rather than being extracted by foreign corporations. Burkinabe populations celebrated gold nationalizations, supported my government despite Western condemnation, and expressed pride that Burkinabe gold now funds Burkinabe development rather than enriching Canadian, British, and French shareholders. This popular support creates domestic political foundation, making Western-backed coups more difficult. Populations will resist rather than support opposition movements perceived as serving Western interests against African sovereignty. African populations' growing support for resource nationalism reflects recognition that decades of Western corporate extraction left Africa poor while enriching foreign investors, creating political environment hostile to Western intervention against leaders controlling resources for African benefit. But Western power to prevent African resource control is declining as Chinese and Russian influence in Africa grows, as African nations coordinate resistance to Western pressure, and as African populations increasingly support leaders prioritizing sovereignty over Western approval. Chinese economic engagement in Africa exceeds Western engagement in multiple sectors, including infrastructure investment, trade volumes, and development financing. Chinese willingness to provide loans and investments without political conditions Western institutions impose makes China an attractive alternative partner for African nations pursuing policies Western powers oppose, including resource nationalizations threatening Western corporate interests. Chinese technical expertise in mining, manufacturing, and infrastructure enables African nations to operate nationalized industries without depending on Western corporations or technical assistance. Russian military partnerships provide African governments with security capabilities, reducing vulnerability to Western pressure or intervention. Russia supplies weapons, training, intelligence cooperation, and in some cases direct military assistance through contractors, creating security relationships independent of Western military partnerships African nations previously depended on. Russian willingness to support African governments Western powers oppose, including military regimes like mine that seized power through coups, provides crucial security backing, enabling African leaders to defy Western pressure without fearing isolation or intervention. Russian economic interests in African resources align with African resource nationalism because Russia prefers bilateral agreements with African governments over Western corporate dominance, creating mutual interests supporting African resource sovereignty over resources. African nations coordinating resistance to Western pressure multiplies effectiveness of individual nations' defiance. When Burkina Faso, Mali, and Guinea coordinate positions opposing Western interference, ECOWAS cannot effectively isolate any individual nation because regional solidarity prevents isolation. When multiple African nations simultaneously demand renegotiation of mining agreements or threaten nationalizations, Western corporations and governments cannot concentrate pressure on isolated targets but must address coordinated African challenge. When African nations share strategies for resisting Western economic warfare, including mechanisms for bypassing Western financial systems, reducing dependence on Western trade, and building alternative partnerships, each nation benefits from collective knowledge, making resistance more effective. African populations' increasing support for leaders prioritizing sovereignty over Western approval creates political dynamics, favoring resource nationalism over maintaining Western-friendly policies. African populations across our 54 nations increasingly recognize that decades of following Western economic advice, accepting Western corporate extraction, and prioritizing Western approval produced persistent poverty despite abundant African resources. Young Africans especially reject the narrative that African development requires attracting Western investment through favorable terms, recognizing this narrative serves Western corporate interests while keeping Africa subordinated. Growing Pan-African sentiment celebrating sovereignty, opposing neo-colonial extraction, and supporting leaders who defy Western pressure creates political environment where African leaders gain domestic legitimacy through confronting Western powers rather than cooperating with them. The era when Western corporations could freely extract African resources through agreements heavily favoring foreign interests is ending, replaced by future, where African nations control their resources and deploy them strategically to build genuine sovereignty and development. This transformation isn't complete. Western corporations still control significant African mining operations, oil production, agricultural exports, and other resource sectors across multiple African nations. But the direction is clear, and momentum is building. More African nations are renegotiating unfavorable agreements. More African leaders are nationalizing foreign-controlled industries. More African populations are supporting resource control despite Western warnings, and more African governments are coordinating strategies for reducing Western economic dominance. Ghana is renegotiating gold mining agreements demanding higher royalty payments and greater state participation in mining revenues. Mali nationalized some mining assets and increased state ownership stakes in gold operations previously controlled entirely by foreign corporations. Guinea demanded renegotiation of bauxite mining agreements with Western aluminum companies, threatening nationalization if companies refused more favorable terms. Democratic Republic of Congo reviewed mining contracts signed under previous governments, canceling agreements determined to be excessively favorable to foreign corporations at Congolese expense. Tanzania and Zambia increased mining taxes and royalties despite Western corporate objections, asserting sovereign right to determine taxation policies serving national interests rather than corporate profits. These actions across multiple African nations demonstrate that resource nationalism is spreading movement rather than isolated incidents pattern, proving African leaders increasingly prioritize controlling resources over maintaining favorable investment climates attracting Western corporations. As more African nations assert control over resources and observe that Western threats of economic isolation or investment withdrawal prove manageable when nations have alternative partnerships and popular support, more African leaders will gain confidence to pursue similar nationalizations. This cascading effect gradually shifts African resources from Western corporate control to African state control, fundamentally transforming economic relationships between Africa and Western powers from extraction favoring foreign interests to sovereignty serving African development. The gold we mine is our weapon accelerating this transformation, and your condemnation only proves how much you fear African economic liberation threatening Western and Israeli dominance. Burkinabe gold under state control provides revenues, funding, development, military capabilities, and financial reserves proving resource nationalism works practical demonstration, inspiring other African nations to follow our example. Burkinabe's success nationalizing gold without experiencing economic collapse. Western propaganda predicted destroys Western narratives, claiming resource control causes disaster, making African populations and leaders more skeptical of Western warnings opposing nationalizations. Burkinabe deployment of gold revenues to build partnerships with Russia and China independent of Western influence demonstrates strategic benefits. Resource control provides beyond just increased revenues, showing African nations that controlling resources enables genuine sovereignty rather than just marginal revenue increases. Your condemnation exposes Western and Israeli fear that African resource control threatens their global dominance. If you genuinely believed nationalizations would harm African development as your propaganda claims, you would welcome African resource nationalism, expecting it to produce failures, proving Western corporate extraction serves African interests better than state control. But you condemned nationalizations immediately and applied pressure attempting to reverse resource control, proving you recognize nationalizations threaten Western and Israeli interests rather than African interests. Your fear is rational because African control over African resources enables African economic independence, reducing Western leverage, generates revenues funding African military capabilities, challenging Western military dominance, and demonstrates that African development without Western corporate extraction is viable and superior to continued subordination. See the truth, Netanyahu. The gold we mine is our weapon against your geopolitical games, and you cannot stop us from destroying Western extraction systems keeping Africa poor. You condemned my nationalization of Burkinabe gold mines as violation of property rights while defending Israeli control over Syrian Golan Heights resources seized through military force for 58 years. You warned that seizing foreign corporate assets would isolate Burkina Faso economically, yet 3 years later we're thriving with gold revenues funding development, Russian military partnerships strengthening security, and Chinese infrastructure projects transforming our economy. You claimed nationalizations violate international investment norms while ignoring Western corporate extraction agreements that paid Burkina Faso minimal compensation for billions of dollars worth of gold extracted over decades. Listen carefully to the comprehensive hypocrisy your condemnations reveal when compared with Israeli actions and Western corporate practices you defend. You condemned my nationalization, emphasizing property rights must be respected and that seizing foreign corporate assets violates international investment norms. Yet Israel controls Syrian Golan Heights resources, including water sources, providing 1/3 of Israel's water supply and agricultural land cultivated by Israeli settlers, resources seized through military conquest in 1967 and maintained through illegal occupation. An annexation declared null and void by UN Security Council Resolution 497. If property rights and territorial sovereignty matter principles you invoked condemning my nationalizations, then Israeli control over Syrian resources seized through military force for 58 years deserves far more severe condemnation than my legal nationalization of mining operations on Burkinabe sovereign territory. The contrast is absolute. I nationalized gold mines on Burkinabe sovereign territory, using Burkinabe legal authority to assert control over Burkinabe resources for Burkinabe benefit. Israel seized Syrian resources through military conquest, annexed Syrian territory in violation of international law, and exploits Syrian water and land for Israeli benefit over sustained Syrian opposition. Yet you condemned my legal exercise of sovereignty over Burkinabe resources while defending illegal Israeli control over Syrian resources. This proves your concern isn't actually about property rights or sovereignty. It's about maintaining Western and Israeli capacity to control and exploit resources in Africa, Middle East, and Global South, regardless of whether that control is legal, consensual, or beneficial to populations whose resources are controlled. You warned that nationalizing foreign corporate assets would isolate Burkina Faso economically, predicting that foreign investors would withdraw, international financial institutions would reduce engagement, and Burkina Faso would face economic catastrophe from loss of Western economic partnerships. 3 years later, these warnings proved completely false as Burkina Faso thrives economically under state control of gold resources. Gold production remains stable at approximately 60 tons annually, proving state-owned operations maintain production levels comparable to previous corporate control. State revenues from gold increased to over $2 billion annually, compared to under $200 million under corporate extraction, proving state ownership captures far more wealth for national benefit than corporate agreements, repatriating most profits to foreign shareholders. Russian military partnerships strengthened Burkinabe's security capabilities through weapons supplies, training programs, and intelligence cooperation, enabling Burkinabe forces to achieve greater success against jihadist groups than Western-trained forces achieved under previous governments. Chinese infrastructure projects are transforming Burkinabe economy through road construction, connecting previously isolated regions, electricity expansion, powering economic development, telecommunications infrastructure enabling modern commerce, and agricultural investments, increasing food production and export capacity. Alternative partnerships with Russia, China, Turkey, Iran, and other non-Western powers provide trade, investment, technical expertise, and diplomatic support, ensuring Burkina Faso maintains international economic engagement despite Western displeasure. Your prediction that nationalizations would isolate Burkina Faso economically failed because you assumed Western economic dominance was so complete that African nations could not survive without Western approval and partnerships. But Chinese and Russian willingness to partner with African nations pursuing sovereignty-focused policies Western powers oppose means African nations can achieve economic success despite Western pressure. Burkinabe's success, thriving economically after nationalizations despite Western warnings, proves your threats of economic isolation are empty when African nations have alternative partners and control valuable resources Western powers need. This demonstration encourages other African nations to defy Western economic pressure because Burkinabe example proves Western threats are manageable and alternative partnerships are viable. You claimed nationalizations violate international investment norms, suggesting my seizure of mining assets breaks rules governing international economic relations. But the extraction agreements I terminated violated Burkinabe sovereignty by granting foreign corporations excessive control over Burkinabe resources through terms heavily favoring corporate profits over national benefit. These agreements required Burkinabe governments to provide tax exemptions, reducing revenues, allowed profit repatriation, transferring wealth to foreign shareholders rather than Burkinabe development, and limited government authority to regulate mining operations, protecting environmental standards or labor rights. Agreements so favorable to foreign corporations that they generated minimal Burkinabe benefit from abundant Burkinabe resources, violated spirit of sovereign equality, underlying legitimate international investment, making those agreements illegitimate extraction mechanisms rather than fair partnerships. You ignore that Western corporate extraction agreements paid Burkina Faso minimal compensation for billions of dollars worth of gold extracted over decades, proving these agreements were exploitation rather than fair economic partnerships. IAMGold's Essakane mine produced approximately 400,000 ounces of gold annually worth over $800 million, yet paid Burkinabe government less than $50 million annually in taxes and royalties, meaning Burkinabe government received less than 6% of value extracted, while IAMGold and shareholders captured over 90%. Endeavour Mining's operations generated similar disparities where foreign shareholders captured vast majority of wealth, while Burkinabe populations near mine sites remained impoverished without adequate infrastructure, healthcare, or education, despite gold wealth extracted from beneath their land. If international investment norms require fair compensation and mutual benefit principles underlying legitimate economic partnerships, then Western corporate extraction agreements that paid Burkina Faso 5 to 10% of extracted wealth while repatriating 90+% to foreign shareholders violated those norms far more egregiously than my nationalizations, asserting Burkinabe sovereignty over Burkinabe resources. Yet you condemn nationalizations while defending extraction agreements, proving your concern isn't actually about international investment norms, but about maintaining Western corporate capacity to extract African resources on terms favoring foreign profits over African development. Your selective application of investment norms condemning African assertions of sovereignty while defending Western exploitation exposes that your rhetoric about international rules is weapon deployed protecting Western interests rather than genuine commitment to fair economic relations. Your hypocrisy exposes that Israeli and Western opposition to African resource control isn't about principles but about maintaining power to extract our wealth. As long as Western corporations controlled Burkinabe gold, Western governments had leverage, pressuring our policies through threatening companies or restricting investment. State control eliminates that leverage, terrifying Western powers because it demonstrates African economic independence is achievable and that your threats are empty when we control valuable resources and have alternative partners. Listen carefully to the specific leverage mechanisms Western powers lose when African nations control their own resources rather than allowing Western corporate extraction. When Western corporations controlled Burkinabe gold mines, Western governments could pressure Burkinabe policies by threatening those corporations, warning companies that continuing operations in Burkina Faso might become difficult if Burkinabe government pursued policies Western powers opposed, encouraging companies to lobby Burkinabe government for policy changes serving Western interests, or suggesting Western governments might restrict corporate access to Western markets or financing unless companies pressured African governments appropriately. This corporate leverage enabled Western governments to influence African policies indirectly through economic pressure rather than direct political intervention. When Burkinabe state controls gold mines directly, this corporate leverage disappears because threats to Western corporations are irrelevant to state-owned operations. Western governments cannot pressure non-existent foreign corporations operating in Burkina Faso. Western threats to restrict Western corporate investment in Burkina Faso don't affect state-owned gold production. Western warnings about investment climate-harming corporate operations are meaningless when state rather than corporations operates mines. This elimination of corporate leverage forces Western powers seeking to pressure African governments to deploy more direct and visible coercion, economic sanctions, aid cutoffs, diplomatic isolation that are politically costlier, easier for African populations to recognize as hostile Western interference, and more likely to generate African resistance and alternative partnerships with non-Western powers. Western governments also lose leverage through Western financial systems when African nations control resources and deploy revenues strategically to reduce dependence on Western banking, currencies, and financial institutions. When Western corporations extracted Burkinabe gold, revenues flowed through Western financial systems, gold sales processed through Western commodity markets, dollar payments transferred through Western banks, corporate profits deposited in Western financial institutions. This integration into Western financial systems gave Western governments multiple pressure points. They could threaten freezing assets held in Western banks, restricting access to Western financial markets, blocking dollar transactions, or imposing financial sanctions, cutting targeted African entities off from Western financial systems. When Burkinabe state controls gold and deploys it strategically through non-Western partnerships, much of this financial leverage evaporates. Gold sales to China and Russia for yuan or rubles rather than dollars reduce Burkinabe dependence on dollar transactions Western financial sanctions target. Gold held as reserves in Burkinabe vaults or with non-Western financial institutions rather than deposited in Western banks eliminates Western capacity to freeze assets. Gold for goods arrangements bypassing currency transactions entirely avoid Western financial system monitoring and control. Direct bilateral agreements with Russia for military equipment paid partly through gold transfers eliminate Western intermediaries who could be pressured to restrict transactions. These mechanisms for operating outside Western financial systems make Western financial warfare less effective, reducing Western leverage over African nations controlling resources and deploying them strategically. Western governments lose leverage through investment flows when African nations demonstrate that nationalizing Western-controlled industries doesn't produce economic catastrophe. Western propaganda predicts. Western powers have long maintained that African nations must maintain favorable investment climates, attracting Western corporate investment because African development supposedly depends on Western capital and expertise. This narrative created fear among African leaders that policies Western investors oppose, including nationalizations, increased taxation, Stricter regulations would cause Western investment withdrawal, producing economic decline. Fear of losing Western investment gave Western powers leverage over African policies because African leaders believed maintaining Western corporate presence was essential for development. Burkinabe's success nationalizing gold without economic collapse destroys this leverage by proving African nations can develop through controlling their own resources rather than depending on Western corporate investment. When other African leaders observe that Burkina Faso nationalizes major gold mines, yet maintains stable production, increases state revenues dramatically, funds visible development improvements, and builds successful partnerships with non-Western powers, they conclude that Western warnings about catastrophic consequences of nationalizations are propaganda rather than objective economic analysis. This recognition liberates African leaders from fear of Western investment withdrawal, understanding that controlling resources and partnering with non-Western powers enables development independent of Western corporate investment. As this fear dissipates, Western leverage through threatening investment withdrawal disappears, because African leaders no longer believe their nation's development depends on maintaining policies Western investors favor. State control eliminates Western leverage, terrifying Western powers because it demonstrates African economic independence is achievable and that your threats are empty when we control valuable resources and have alternative partners. This terror is rational from Western perspective because African resource control threatens entire systems sustaining Western economic dominance over Africa. Western prosperity depends partly on extracting African resources through corporate operations, paying minimal compensation. Losing this extraction reduces Western corporate profits and Western access to resources at favorable prices. Western geopolitical influence depends partly on economic leverage over African governments. Losing this leverage reduces Western capacity to pressure African policies serving Western strategic interests. Western global dominance depends partly on maintaining systems where Africa provides raw materials enriching Western corporations while remaining economically dependent. Losing this system enables African economic independence, potentially shifting global power balances. My nationalization of Burkinabe gold demonstrates that African nations can break free from Western economic control, and this demonstration terrifies Western powers because they recognize other African nations will follow our example if we succeed. Success means maintaining gold production, proving state ownership works, increasing revenues, proving resource control benefits, national development, building alternative partnerships, proving African nations don't need Western approval, and visibly improving Burkinabe, prosperity, proving economic independence serves African interests better than Western corporate extraction. 3 years after nationalizations, all these success indicators are evident. Production remains stable, revenues increase dramatically, partnerships with Russia and China are thriving, and infrastructure improvements demonstrate gold wealth is funding development rather than being extracted by foreign shareholders. This success encourages resource nationalism across Africa by proving Western threats are empty and African resource control is viable. Ghana, Mali, Guinea, Tanzania, Zambia, Democratic Republic of Congo, and other African nations are demanding renegotiations of mining agreements or pursuing nationalizations process directly inspired by observing Burkinabe's success controlling gold. As more African nations assert resource control, Western corporate extraction collapses across continent, Western economic leverage over Africa disappears, and African economic independence becomes reality rather than aspiration. Western powers recognize this cascading effect threatens their interests fundamentally, which is why they condemned my nationalization so strongly, despite claiming to respect sovereignty and legal authority within recognized borders. The gold we mine funds military modernization with Russia, infrastructure development with China, financial reserves protecting against Western economic warfare, and diplomatic partnerships independent of Western influence. Gold gives us strategic autonomy you spent decades ensuring we'd never achieve. Other African nations are watching our success and calculating whether to follow our example, nationalizing industries currently controlled by Western corporations. Your condemnation accelerates this process by exposing Western desperation to maintain extraction systems. Listen carefully to the comprehensive strategic deployment of gold revenues, building Burkinabe sovereignty and inspiring continental transformation. Military modernization with Russia uses gold revenues to purchase advanced weapons systems, armored vehicles, surveillance technology, and ammunition that Burkinabe forces need to combat jihadist groups more effectively than Western supplied equipment enabled. Russian military trainers paid partly through gold revenues provide expertise in counterinsurgency tactics, intelligence operations, and force coordination that improve Burkinabe military effectiveness beyond levels Western training programs achieved. Gold revenues fund salaries, equipment, and operations for expanded Burkinabe security forces, enabling recruitment of additional soldiers, creation of specialized units, and sustained operations in regions previously ceded to jihadist control due to insufficient forces. This military strengthening serves dual purposes: improving security against jihadist threats that terrorized Burkinabe populations under previous governments, and reducing Burkinabe vulnerability to Western pressure or intervention attempting to reverse nationalizations. Stronger military capabilities deter Western-backed coups or opposition movements that might attempt overthrowing my government to restore Western corporate control over gold. Russian military partnership provides security backing, ensuring Burkina Faso isn't isolated, facing Western hostility alone, creating deterrent against Western intervention. Military modernization funded by gold revenues demonstrates practically that resource control enables capabilities previous governments couldn't achieve, despite Western military assistance proving to Burkinabe populations that sovereignty over resources strengthens rather than weakens national security. Infrastructure development with China transforms Burkinabe economy through projects Western aid never funded, despite decades of extraction enriching Western corporations. Chinese construction companies, financed partly through gold revenues, are building hundreds of kilometers of paved roads, connecting Burkinabe regions previously isolated by inadequate transportation infrastructure, enabling agricultural products to reach markets, facilitating commerce between regions, and integrating national economy. Chinese electricity projects expand power generation and distribution, reaching rural areas where most Burkinabe populations lack reliable electricity, powering economic development, improving living standards, and enabling modern services. Chinese telecommunications investments build mobile networks and internet infrastructure, enabling Burkinabe participation in digital economy, connecting previously isolated populations and creating opportunities for education, commerce, and communication. Chinese infrastructure projects demonstrate practically that gold revenues under Burkinabe Control Fund development Western corporations never delivered, despite extracting billions of dollars worth of gold for decades. Burkinabe populations observe roads, electricity, telecommunications, schools, and hospitals being built with gold revenues, tangible improvements they never saw when Western corporations extracted gold and repatriated profits to foreign shareholders. This practical demonstration that resource control enables development, validates nationalizations, and generates popular support for continued state ownership, despite Western propaganda claiming nationalizations harm development. As Burkinabe prosperity visibly improves through infrastructure funded by gold revenues, populations across Africa observe and demand their leaders similarly control resources for national benefit rather than allowing Western corporate extraction perpetuating poverty. Financial reserves protecting against Western economic warfare use gold holdings to create buffers, enabling Burkinabe government to withstand Western sanctions, aid cutoffs, and economic pressure without capitulating to Western demands. When ECOWAS imposed sanctions after my coup, gold reserves provided resources, importing essential goods despite trade restrictions. When Western aid agencies suspended development assistance to pressure policy changes, gold revenues funded programs Western aid previously supported, proving Burkinabe independence from Western financial leverage. When Western financial institutions froze some Burkinabe assets, gold reserves held outside Western financial systems remained accessible. These experiences demonstrated practically that gold reserves enable resistance to Western economic warfare, encouraging other African nations to similarly build reserves, reducing vulnerability to Western pressure. Gold holdings also provide hard currency reserves, maintaining confidence in Burkinabe financial system despite Western attempts to destabilize Burkinabe economy. Gold-backed reserves assure international partners and domestic populations that Burkinabe currency and financial system have solid foundations, reducing effectiveness of Western propaganda, claiming nationalizations will cause economic collapse. Gold reserves enable Burkinabe government to intervene, supporting currency value if Western financial attacks attempt causing depreciation. Gold provides universally recognized store of value that Burkinabe government can deploy in international transactions without requiring Western financial institutions' approval or participation. These functions make gold reserves an essential component of economic sovereignty, enabling Burkina Faso to resist Western pressure without experiencing economic catastrophe. Diplomatic partnerships independent of Western influence use gold strategically to build relationships with Russia, China, Turkey, Iran, and other nations offering cooperation without Western-style political conditions. Gold as payment or collateral in agreements with Russia securing military cooperation creates partnership independent of Western approval. Russia receives valuable commodity, while Burkina Faso receives security assistance. Western powers refuse to provide on terms respecting sovereignty. Gold in agreements with China financing infrastructure projects enables development without IMF loan conditions requiring austerity or privatization that harm populations. Gold in bilateral trade arrangements with Iran and Turkey diversifies Burkinabe economic partnerships, reducing dependence on Western markets. These gold-backed diplomatic partnerships create alternative international system where African nations can operate independent of Western approval, achieving sovereignty. Previous generations of African leaders couldn't realize because they lacked resources to offer valuable partners, because they didn't control their resources to deploy strategically. Gold gives us strategic autonomy. You spent decades ensuring we'd never achieve autonomy to pursue policies serving Burkinabe interests despite Western opposition. Autonomy to build partnerships with non-Western powers despite Western warnings. Autonomy to resist Western pressure without facing isolated economic warfare we couldn't withstand. This autonomy represents genuine sovereignty rather than nominal independence, where African nations formally control their territories but remain effectively subordinated to Western economic and political dominance. Other African nations are watching our success and calculating whether to follow our example, nationalizing industries currently controlled by Western corporations. Ghana observes that Burkina Faso maintains gold production after nationalizations, proving state ownership doesn't cause operational collapse. Mali sees Burkinabe gold revenues funding visible development, demonstrating resource control benefits populations rather than harming them as Western propaganda claims. Guinea notices Burkinabe partnerships with Russia and China thriving, proving alternative partnerships are viable when Western powers object to African policies. Tanzania recognizes Burkinabe resistance to Western pressure succeeds, encouraging belief that defying Western demands is sustainable rather than catastrophically costly. These observations translate into policy changes as African leaders conclude that resource nationalism is viable and beneficial. Ghana demanded renegotiations, increasing state participation in gold mining revenues and threatening nationalizations if companies refuse. Mali nationalized some mining assets outright following Burkinabe example. Guinea suspended mining operations, demanding renegotiations on terms more favorable to Guinean interests. Zambia and Tanzania increased mining taxes despite corporate objections. These actions demonstrate Burkinabe example as inspiring continental movement toward resource control, exactly the cascading effect Western powers fear, because it threatens collapsing entire system of Western corporate extraction across Africa. Your condemnation accelerates this process by exposing Western desperation to maintain extraction systems, making African leaders and populations more confident that resource nationalism threatens Western interests sufficiently to warrant pursuing despite Western opposition. If nationalizations genuinely harmed African development as Western propaganda claims, Western powers would welcome African resource nationalism, expecting failures, proving Western corporate extraction serves African interests better. But your strong condemnation, pressure tactics, and propaganda campaigns prove you recognize resource nationalism threatens Western interests, validating African suspicions that Western extraction systems exist to serve Western rather than African benefit. This validation encourages more African nations to pursue nationalizations because Western desperation proves resource control is worth fighting for despite Western threats. We're deploying gold as weapon and African economic liberation is unstoppable. You cannot prevent what's inevitable. Your geopolitical games are collapsing. African sovereignty over African resources is coming. And nothing you threaten changes this reality. Listen carefully to why African economic liberation through resource control is inevitable regardless of Western and Israeli opposition. First, African populations increasingly demand their governments control resources for African benefit rather than allowing Western corporate extraction, perpetuating poverty despite abundant African wealth. Young Africans especially reject narratives that African development requires attracting Western investment through favorable terms, recognizing these narratives serve Western corporate interests while keeping Africa subordinated. Growing Pan-African consciousness celebrates sovereignty, opposes neocolonial extraction, and supports leaders defying Western pressure. This popular pressure creates political dynamics where African leaders gain legitimacy through controlling resources and confronting Western powers rather than maintaining policies Western investors favor. Second, successful examples like Burkinabe gold nationalization prove resource control is viable and beneficial, destroying Western propaganda, claiming nationalizations cause economic catastrophe. As more African nations observe Burkina Faso thriving after nationalizations, Ghana succeeding with increased mining revenues, Mali operating nationalized assets, and other resource nationalist examples demonstrating viability, African leaders gain confidence that controlling resources is achievable rather than economically suicidal. Practical demonstrations matter more than Western theoretical warnings. When African nations see peers succeeding with resource control, they conclude Western warnings are propaganda designed to maintain extraction rather than objective economic analysis protecting African interests. Third, Chinese and Russian willingness to partner with African nations pursuing resource nationalism enables African governments to succeed despite Western opposition. Chinese infrastructure investment, technical expertise, and trade partnerships provide African nations with alternatives to Western economic engagement, meaning African governments can nationalize Western-controlled industries without facing complete economic isolation. Russian military partnerships provide security backing, deterring Western intervention against resource nationalist leaders, meaning African governments can defy Western pressure without being overthrown through Western-backed coups. These alternative partnerships create space for African resource nationalism to succeed, where previous attempts failed due to African isolation facing overwhelming Western pressure. Fourth, Western power to prevent African resource control is declining as Western economic dominance erodes relative to rising powers. American economic supremacy that enabled the U.S. to dictate global economic rules is being challenged by Chinese economic growth, European strategic autonomy from the U.S., and a multipolar economic system emerging. European unity that might enable the EU to pressure African nations collectively is fragmenting as European nations pursue different interests in Africa. Western financial system that enabled Western economic warfare through sanctions and asset freezes is being bypassed through alternative payment systems, digital currencies, and bilateral arrangements avoiding dollar transactions. Western military dominance that enabled interventions against leaders threatening Western interests is being challenged by Russian and Chinese military capabilities and by Western public opposition to expensive foreign interventions. All these trends reduce Western capacity to prevent African resource control through pressure or intervention. You cannot prevent what's inevitable because historical forces favor African resource control over continued Western extraction. Post-colonial African populations refuse permanent subordination to Western economic dominance, creating political pressures forcing African leaders to assert resource sovereignty or face domestic legitimacy challenges. Global power shifts toward multipolarity, create alternatives to Western dominance, enabling African nations to succeed despite Western opposition. African resource wealth provides leverage. African nations are learning to deploy strategically, making Western threats less effective against nations, controlling valuable resources, and having alternative partners. African coordination in resisting Western pressure multiplies effectiveness, making isolated interventions against individual nations less feasible and coordinated Western pressure more difficult to sustain.